Criminals are using artificial intelligence to steal your identity and drain your savings, and it's working. But the fix Congress is weighing, a national digital ID, could end up tracking everything you do.
The Department of Government Efficiency, which many of us thought was the Department of Government Evil, used a key Social Security Administration identity database to mark thousands of living people as dead in order to exert financial hardship. A whistleblower recently said that he planned to expand this to millions of people. Now, do we really want to move to a system where the government can invalidate any ID it wants to just by sending an instruction to the phone that's in your pocket? I can absolutely think of places where digital ID has valid uses for age verification and for fraud prevention. But every place that an American taps their phone to access services cannot be a breadcrumb to the track or breadcrumb follow the track process in their daily lives. So I'm excited to have those of you who are here to discuss the new technologies to prevent fraud against the American taxpayer. We must also ensure that we keep an eye on the horizon to prevent any sort of mass surveillance and government surveillance that can literally decide if, in fact, we are considered live or dead. So I want to thank the chairman again for keeping his commitment on this issue, for members on both sides of the aisle that continue to plow through this. It's been a couple of years now.
To testify today. I serve as head of fraud insight at Centrelink and as a professor of criminal justice and criminology at Georgia State University. For nearly 2 decades, I have studied cybercrime by going where it happens, into darknet markets, Telegram channels, and encrypted platforms where fraudsters buy, sell, and teach each other how to steal from government programs. I also go into the field myself, to the mail drops, virtual offices, and shell addresses these operations use to look legitimate. My testimony today is based on that first-hand work. The central lesson from my research is this: fraud against government programs is no longer a series of isolated schemes. It is a durable, specialized criminal infrastructure, and it moves. The pandemic did not create this infrastructure, but it supercharged it. Criminals learned how to acquire stolen and synthetic identities, stand up shell companies, open bank accounts, and recruit money mules at scale. When pandemic relief programs ended, none of that capacity disappeared. It simply migrated. Today, my team is tracking that same infrastructure inside SNAP, Medicare, Medicaid, federal student aid, tax refunds, and SBA-backed loans. A few examples illustrate how. We're watching criminals combine stolen identities with AI-generated faces and deepfake video to defeat liveness checks at digital banks and tax preparers using nothing more exotic than face-swapping software available to anyone. We are watching an EBT fraud market where one criminal steals card data, a separate paid service verifies the balance before the card is even used, and a third actor cashes it out. And my own field investigation of a Florida durable medical equipment company whose office I found abandoned in Delray Beach is now tied to a Department of Justice case alleging $3.76 billion in fraudulent Medicare and Medicaid claims. Different programs, different agencies, same playbook. The same stolen identity, the same shell company, the same bank account, reused across systems that rarely talk to each other. That fragmentation is the vulnerability. Criminals exploit the seams between agencies precisely because our defenses are built program by program, while their infrastructure is built to move across all of them. Given my time today, I want to leave the subcommittee with 4 priorities. First, replace self-attestation with verified data wherever the risk is high. Too many programs still take applicants at their word on income, identity, or eligibility. That was the single biggest vulnerability exploited during the pandemic, and it remains one today. Second, expand real-time cross-agency data matching. The same identity that files a fraudulent tax return can apply for a SNAP benefit the same week. Agencies that only compare notes in periodic batch runs weeks after the money is gone cannot see that pattern. They need to see it before disbursement, not after. Third, Strengthen prepayment screening and move toward risk-based disbursement. Build on the model of Treasury's do not pay system, but expand its authority and its reach so that suspicious payments are held before they leave the government rather than chased afterward through recovery audits that criminals have already outrun. Fourth, give agencies the flexibility to adopt smarter tools and keep it current. Much of today's verification infrastructure and the policies behind them were built for an earlier threat. And procurement and rule-making cycles that take years cannot keep pace with fraud tactics that shift in months or less. Agencies need standing authority to test and deploy technologies to meet the current threats, not just at the next scheduled audit. None of this requires slowing down help for legitimate applicants. It requires distinguishing them from fraud earlier, using signals criminals cannot easily fabricate. The federal government already has some of the tools it needs, which is, what is missing is the authority, the coordination, and the sustained investment to use those tools before the money moves, not after. Every dollar we protect from organized fraud is a dollar that stays available for the people Congress intended to help. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Dr. Maiman, thank you very much. Mr.
It's like Palantir to create databases of Americans' personal data for government use. We know that during the Doge era, similar things were done during that as well. This data collection could make it easier for private companies to abuse our data. I know some proponents will say, well, this is mainly for government use, but we know it's not only for government use. And that's part of my concern with this. There's just so much collaboration between private companies, data sharing. How should we legislate on balancing the convenience and the real dangers of digital ID, which also will lead to losing anonymity online, which is something else I'm concerned about as well?
Yeah, we have a piece on our site that outlines 12 protections that we call for, that we think state legislatures should enact that govern any mobile driver's license or digital ID that's created in their state. I won't go through them all, but they include such things as protecting people against incessant demands from every quarter. If you want to do business with us or come in our candy store, you have to tap your ID and give us your driver's license.
Yeah, this is part of my concern too, that making it easier to prove who you are will lead to more services companies asking you to do so for every service that is not expected of you right now.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, because one of the things that, if you're a website and it's really, really hard to prove your identity online, you have to take a photo of your ID, you have to send it in, you have to get a video, you have to do proof of liveness, all this stuff. You're not going to ask your visitors, your users, to do that unless you really need to. So that imposes a limit. But by getting rid of all the friction of proving who you are online, you get a pop-up like the privacy pop-ups we get today. Click here to send us your digital ID. Not only become easier for me to share my digital ID, that means that it makes it much easier for them to ask me to, or demand that I do so. And that's one of the big things and that's one of the protections that policymakers can make, which is to say, these are super IDs, they're cryptographically locked down, DMV vetted, everything like that. This is, and that you shouldn't be forced to use a super ID to prove your identity unless it's legally required, we have called for, maybe in certain other specific situations. But people are gonna need protection against this absolute, waterfall of demands that you can easily anticipate are going to happen once this is created. And then other protections like privacy protections to make sure that the wallet holders aren't spying on everybody, and that that these cryptographical things that I talked about are built in to protect privacy, so that you can prove things about yourself without having to create a lifelong relationship with somebody by identifying yourself to them.
How can, I know we're over, if you indulge me, Mr. Chair, just my last question is, how can digital ID lead to complete loss of anonymity online?
Yeah, so, websites are gonna want everybody to identify themselves all the time. They're gonna wanna do it because their ads will be worth more if they know who you are and they can plug in the data they have about you to other data they get. They're going to want to do it to make sure that you're of age so they can market to you under COPPA, which is, you can't market to people under 13. Identity verification, which has become a big controversial issue. And bots. A lot of sites are having problems with AI impersonating humans, and they're going to want to know that you're a human. for various reasons. And so there's going to be a lot of pressure for a lot of websites to start demanding this all the time.
And part of the concern, right, is the fact that this information can be weaponized against consumers, working people who are looking to purchase things online, and have that information leveraged against them when they're making decisions on what they want to buy and how much those items cost, correct?
Yeah, surveillance pricing, where stores get a bunch of data about their customers and then they charge you based on what they know about you and how much they think you'll pay and whether you're desperate and so forth. That's become a very controversial issue, and states, as regulation of surveillance pricing has been attracting support in the state legislatures from both left and right. And digital IDs will make that much easier, because if you know they're going to charge, if the store is going to charge you more, like let's say that the airline happens to know that you've just lost a close loved one and you have to fly, they can up your price.
Yeah.
And so you're going to want to see what the price is without them knowing who you are, right? But they're going to want to know who you are, and there will be this arms race. And a digital ID would sort of end that arms race and mean that you can't escape them knowing who you are.
Yeah,
if it's done badly.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you for indulging me, Mr. Chair. I just think, I'm not a Luddite, and I just think like these conversations are important because it shows how much care and intentionality needs to be put into this. Oftentimes, we're very excited about something, we move quickly on it without thinking the next 10, 20 years into the future, and then it's an emergency for another generation to handle. I think we have to have these conversations now and legislate accordingly. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much, gentlewoman. But we're talking about fraud, and we're talking about how would you expect the government, are there parameters? The government can only go so far. Are we going to give the criminals that upper hand? So that's the question, sir.
Okay, yeah. So if you're talking about investigating fraud that you have evidence has already happened, I think that it would become a criminal investigation like any other. And that is subject to the Constitution, the limits of the Constitution, presumption of innocence, and the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution prohibiting unreasonable searches and seizures, and other provisions of the Constitution that have been well litigated over the years. So I would think that a professional law enforcement officer would know what those limits are in many ways. And whether
have you had a chance, Mr. Stanley, to look at the piece of legislation that was passed by this committee a few weeks ago that's waiting for floor arrival that would take these options and move them to the IG in the Treasury Department in a specialized unit that are law enforcement type people? Have you looked at that?
I confess that I had not. I would be happy to and get back to the committee with our views.
If you could do that, I'm interested in your feedback, because we are trying to say that we believe once a standard of fraud has been established, that there needs to be specialized, sure, but the ability that investigators have to go and vet this, we just have to find a way. Is it truthful? How widespread is it? And how are we going to handle this? Okay, I'm going to ask you another question. Got 5 seconds left, but we're kind of being a little careful. We're not as tight on this. The second one is there a limitation on someone if they are presently on Social Security, they've taken out a loan, SBA, something where they've in the government system, and we find some instances where there might be questions that arise. And I know, once again, you're very careful, and I agree with that, within the law, within the Bill of Rights, within the Constitution, within all the things that we could establish. Is it fair game to go back and run people back through if they think there's something that might be amiss through this organization, even though a person has been on government benefits? Because you see, we think that a lot of people that presently are receiving government benefits might not be exactly as we thought they were. Is that fair game?
I think it is, with some cautions. I think if a government agency sees signs of fraud, there's no reason why it shouldn't.
Right. That has to be established.
There are cautions, especially if you are looking at, for example, using AI algorithms in order to do that, that may have been trained on sets of pre-existing data that contain biases. That there was a man, there was an NBC report, which I could share with the committee about it, who paid his credit card off every month in full, and he got a letter from his credit card, and they said, we're reducing your credit limit. And he said, why? I pay off in full. And they said, because we have found that the other customers at some of the stores you shop at have been bad credit. And I think that strikes most people as just unfair and guilt by association.
That would be a smell test. How
yeah,
about
but I think that a lot of AI algorithms do basically the same thing in a hidden way.
How about if AI discovered that there are 74 people at your home address that receive benefits because AI discovered it, and we think that you might be one of them, and we'd like to do some sort of a review about this. Is that fair game?
I think that there are good uses of AI, and that flagging that kind of anomaly, as long as there's human review, might make sense. But for examples like that, there are other examples where we see, unfortunately, government agencies not building in the checks and balances, the due process, and using AI not only to figure out who it thinks is suspicious, but then to take actions against people that they have trouble getting due process and fighting back. We've seen, for example, in states, people losing their disability benefits based on algorithms.
Okay, so let me give you that. It would then at some point require human intervention to review data to then make some decision, as opposed to a computer automatically assuming something.
I think that's right. The only other caveat I would add is that some of the fraud prevention techniques are based on gathering an enormous amount of intrusive data about individuals.
And we spoke about this, but you had indicated earlier without human intervention, that meant that someone else, a computer or an AI modeling, decided they could send you a letter and cut off your benefits. I'm saying that we could use these to then go to a human who is trained, who does have this professional experience, who would be able to apply it, and then would be able to use some rational basis. Okay, so you would agree with that?
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that, for example, there are industries that that use unethical apps on people's smartphones to track their location without their knowledge or permission. I'm sure that many people in this room are being tracked by these companies without knowing, and that some of that data can be fed into these algorithms for deciding who is suspicious, and a lot of other very privacy invading data. And so if the algorithm you're talking about is based on that kind of very intrusive privacy invading data sources, we would have a problem with that.
Okay, well, I could bring up lots of examples. I'm not going to. I want to thank you. I think this is an important question. That's why you're here today. We'd now like to move to the distinguished gentleman. We need to hear this about not only that it exists, that they're very active, that they're on the dark web or open web, that they target certain people, and that they learn areas that are vulnerable, and that they openly talk about it. It's no longer behind anybody's back anymore. Do you mind taking the time that you need to express the things that we need to understand about the attack that's against us and our agencies?
With pleasure, Mr. Chairman. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, I spent my time, my days infiltrating darknet platforms, Telegram groups, trying to understand what fraudsters put out there and how they bypass a lot of the security solutions that we deploy on financial institutions as well as on the government side. Oftentimes, what we find in those platforms are tutorials, which will walk you through how to bypass many of the security solutions that we have out there. The tutorials sometimes will be offered for free. Other times you will pay for them, amounts ranging from $150 to $250. Specific guidelines with respect to how to bypass and obtain SBA loans, FAFSA aid. We're seeing, as of earlier this morning, people talking about how to get targets 401k accounts, which I think is a major issue to our country. And we simply see that on scale. We see that, as I mentioned earlier, on Darknet and Telegram, but also more and more on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. A lot of what we see also is available on the internet, on the ClearNet, websites that the criminal put together and simply offer fake driver licenses for sale. This is the reality that we're dealing with. Organized crime groups with very detailed supply chains, which will have our identities offered for sale. They will have services which will allow the fraudsters to build histories around the identities. They will walk you through how to create deepfakes, high-quality deepfakes, both images as well as videos. They will teach you how to take those videos and images and inject them in the cameras of the computers or the smartphone that folks are using in order to apply for benefits or apply for SBA loans, and then secure all those resources that they get from the government. So this is what we're up against. We're seeing that happen domestically with a lot of organized crime groups operating within the United States, but a lot is happening from abroad as well. We're infiltrating.
We are no longer confronting isolated fraudsters. We are facing organized, increasingly sophisticated transnational fraud rings using AI at industrial scale. One fraud ring we profiled created nearly 25,000 synthetic identities and launched more than 35,000 attacks in just 30 days. The adversary has changed. Our federal identity model, however, has not, and yet many in the government believe it will hold up to today or even tomorrow's fraud threat. For decades, the government has treated matching a name, date of birth, and social security number validated against government authoritative records as proof of identity. That approach is no longer sufficient. Further, fraud does not stop at enrollment, and identity verification cannot either. It must become a continuous discipline that evaluates risk throughout the life cycle of an account. From where I sit, identity should be considered critical infrastructure. Nearly every interaction Americans have with their government, benefits, tax administration, disaster relief, veteran services, and healthcare, depends on getting this decision right. Done correctly, better security means better access. It makes it easier to say yes to legitimate Americans and no to industrialized fraud rings. This year, SOCURE supported the Department of Education in deploying real-time risk-based identity screening in the FAFSA process, protecting more than $1 billion in taxpayer funds while allowing over 92% of legitimate applicants to pass automatically. That's the model the government should continue pursuing. Prevention before payment, risk-based rather than one-size-fits-all, continuous rather than point in time, and outcomes rather than checklists. To make this the federal model, I would leave the committee with 5 recommendations. First, measure outcomes, not compliance, requiring systems to prove that they can stop the changing fraud threat. Second, make continuous identity verification the standard across the lifecycle of an account. Third, expand secure data sharing where we know it works through trusted resources like Do Not Pay and other cross-government solutions. Fourth, reward fraud prevention instead of recovery, where agencies are incentivized to stop fraud before taxpayer dollars ever leave the Treasury. And finally, treat identity verification as dynamic infrastructure that must be resourced to evolve continuously, not built once, certified once, and left in place for a decade. To be clear, Congress does not need to prescribe a specific technology, but Congress can establish a new expectation. The technology exists and the evidence is clear. Now our policies and practices must catch up to the threat so Americans can trust their government in the AI era. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
And thank you for your attention to the subject of digital identification, which I don't think has received the attention it deserves. I hope to leave you with 3 overarching points today. First, a digital ID system would be a disaster for individual liberties if it's not done right. If any such system is to become standardized, it must be built with great care and awareness of big potential downsides. We have to ensure America does not become a checkpoint society and that digital IDs don't become virtual ankle monitors, something that tracks us but we can't turn off or escape. Second, the digital ID system that is most likely to become dominant, mobile driver's licenses or MDLs issued by the states, is not being done right. Driver's licenses are already in most Americans' wallets and are by far the most likely form of digital ID to become standard. Login.gov itself is moving towards relying on them. Third, there are much better alternatives if we just do it right. So let me start by explaining my first 2 points, that digital IDs have the potential to be a disaster if they're not done right, and that they are not being done right today. One big problem is that once this infrastructure is built, we start getting identity requests from every direction. Want to enter a 7-Eleven? Scan your ID. Want to buy a cup of coffee? Park your car. Tap here, please. Want to watch a video? Log into social media. Look at a news site, shopping site. Click here to send us your driver's license. There is already far too much tracking that takes place online, and polls show Americans are very uncomfortable with it. But there's been a steady pushback, and that tracking has been getting harder for companies in some ways. A digital ID could lock it down and make it inescapable. You can't just run to the DMV and get a new identity the way you can get a new username and password. Those pushing MDLs in the states have done nothing to counter this easily predictable side effect. We may create a digital ID to solve government fraud or identity theft or other problems, but there's a horde of others waiting in the shadows who will instantly pounce on this infrastructure to use it for their own purposes once it's created. The result will be a checkpoint society of constant ID proofing. With a digital ID, that will be really easy. Just tap, click, or scan. And a digital ID system, if not built carefully, could send a report back to the government every time you show your ID, a record of every beer purchase, bank, and doctor's office visit, and online, every website you visit. This is called Phone Home. This capability was built into the MDL standard as an option. There's also the issue of accessibility. If digital IDs become mandatory, either legally or as a practical matter, that would harm the surprisingly large number of people who don't have a smartphone, about 1 in 10 people in the US, according to studies, including over 1/5 of people over age 65. Some may lack the resources to afford one, others the technological literacy to use them. That's why offline options for doing business are vital to protect. If we don't make sure that digital IDs are an empowering option for people rather than an imprisoning requirement, then people without smartphones will be shut out of many necessary functions of life and often benefits that they sorely need. So these are easily foreseeable, predictable consequences of a digital ID. But that brings me to my third point.
You obviously understand, criminology, you're a professor of it. Help us understand, are most of these threats coming from inside our country, or are we starting to see foreign adversaries exploit some of this data to fraudulently impact some of our constituents?
Thank you so much for the question. Really appreciate it. A lot is coming from abroad. We have a lot going on internally as well. It really depends on the type of fraud we're looking at. In the context of the type of fraud you just mentioned, with folks engaging in online romance fraud, we're seeing a lot coming from places like South Asia. A lot is moving right now to Africa. In some of the online fraud markets that I infiltrate, I spend a lot of time sort of try to infiltrate to Yahoo Boys channels as well as Sakawa Boys channels, where I actually see them using those deepfakes to swap faces while engaging with some of the victims here in the United States. It's heartbreaking to see the level of conversations that these guys are able to get with those targets. And it's also heartbreaking to see the different modus operandi and different types of buckets that those criminals are engaged in. I can tell you that as of this morning, we're seeing more and more Yahoo Boys and Sakawa Boys targeting our 401ks, victims' 401ks. So, we're seeing them convincing targets to borrow against the 401ks, as well as hand over control completely on the 401ks account. So this is what we're up against. We're seeing those deep fakes being used to swap faces, lure targets to give away access to the 401k accounts, and then unfortunately victims funnel the money to bank accounts that the criminals create along with the targets, and then the money leaves the country. So it depends on the type of fraud. The type of fraud that you're referring to definitely comes more from abroad.
Well, I appreciate all of your testimony. The public increasingly relies on the internet to access government services, and I'm just curious, from your perspective, what fraud threats might my constituents be facing that they're not even aware of yet?
Representative, thank you for the question. When it comes to the fraud threats and the way that they're evolving across the landscape, every single interaction, every single time that an individual is engaging both with their government and in their commercial life, there is the chance, the opportunity that an adversary could be attempting to pose as them, could be attempting to enroll in an account. We see this across financial services where we work. We see this across various aspects of the gig economy where we work, and then of course with government organizations. The reality here is that all of the information, all the PII that exists for many folks within this room has been stolen by the adversary, and they are using that to attempt to become them, and therefore that they can access what would be either their bank accounts and help move money all across the economy.
You know, I've heard folks mention anecdotally that now with artificial intelligence, people are trying to impersonate, a loved one by virtue of maybe their voice or their mannerisms, what have you, and using some of that information that may have been stolen. Have you seen that, and could you elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. We are in what I would consider a national crisis. From where I've said, I've highlighted, and our team has highlighted SOCURE for a number of years now, that the moment that we're in is unlike any other in the sense that AI is being used as an accelerator for what attacks that typically would take weeks to occur. And further, it's also becoming more cost effective for the adversary to launch those attacks. So these attacks could be everything from launching deepfakes, things where we've seen an 8,000% increase year over year. This can also be in terms of the velocity by which attacks are happening. This means the speed by which they are occurring. And in these instances, these moments, we are seeing things that where attacks used to take weeks in order to be conducted, they have been broken down to under 48 hours. And this would mean that an adversary has launched an attack where they have stolen my information or yours, or even worse, fabricated an identity, attempted to open an account and or move money, take over an account that may have existed because they went through a call center and were pretending to be you using your voice or something that was cloned, an image of yours, a biometric, et cetera. And they've used all these patterns. And if, like, for say they were blocked in some way, shape, or form, they then just adapt and iterate, and the cycle continues all over again.
Thank you very much. Dr.
Let's break down a House Oversight hearing on a problem that touches almost every American, fraud, and the government's plan to stop it. Witnesses described criminals using artificial intelligence to steal identities at an industrial scale, and lawmakers debated whether stronger digital identity verification is the answer. Underneath it were two things that are both true at once. The fraud threat is real and exploding, and the proposed cure carries real risks of its own. Here's the frame. On one side, fraud experts warned that the old way of proving who you are online is collapsing under AI-powered attacks and pushed for stronger, continuous identity checks. On the other, civil liberties advocates and some lawmakers warned that a national digital identity system could become a surveillance tool. A fair check treats both as serious because the honest truth is that neither side is making it up. So set the two lenses side by side. The security lens asks how we stop criminals from stealing billions using stolen and synthetic identities. The liberty lens asks who controls the identity system we built to stop them, and whether it becomes a permanent record of your life. This breakdown checks each against the evidence, not the fear. 1 ground rule. This is technical and it's easy to scare people in both directions, so we'll keep it factual and measured. We're not here to tell you digital ID is salvation or Big Brother. We're checking what's verifiable, the size of the fraud, how the scams actually work, what the proposed fixes do, and what the privacy trade-offs really are. The goal is clarity for you, not a panic in either direction. Start with what nobody in the room disputed, because it's the ground the whole fight stands on. Here's the scale. Government watchdogs have estimated that fraud against federal programs runs as high as $521 billion a year. Whatever the exact figure, everyone in the room, including the ACLU witness, agreed the losses are enormous and growing. This is not a partisan number. It's the reason a hearing like this happens at all. And here's why it's getting worse fast. Jordan Burris of SOCURE told the committee we're no longer facing loan scammers, but organized transnational fraud rings using AI at industrial scale. He cited one ring that created nearly 25,000 synthetic identities and launched more than 35,000 attacks in a single month. Whether or not you trust any one company's numbers, the direction is not seriously disputed. The attackers have automated. So keep that in mind as the sides clash. This is not a debate between people who take fraud seriously and people who don't. The privacy advocates open by agreeing the threat is real. The disagreement is narrow and honest, not whether to fight fraud, but how to fight it without building something we'll regret. That's a much more useful argument than the shouting usually suggests. Now the first thread, just how big and how fast this threat has grown. One number stopped the room. Witnesses pointed to an explosion in deepfake-enabled fraud, with attempts up by a figure cited as high as 8,000% in a recent stretch. Deepfakes let a criminal clone a voice or a face to defeat the checks that used to catch them. Even if the precise percentage is an industry estimate, the underlying shift that fakes are now cheap and convincing is real and documented. David Myman of Centrelink brought it home to one state, describing roughly $3.76 billion in fraud tied to Florida alone. Myman isn't a theorist about this. He studies cybercrime by going where it lives, inside darknet markets and encrypted channels where fraudsters operate. When a researcher who watches the criminals directly tells you the losses are staggering, that testimony carries real weight. Here's the precise point about these big numbers, in fairness. Fraud estimates are genuinely hard, and different methods produce very different totals, so treat any single figure as a range, not a laser measurement. But the skeptic's usual retort, that the threat is hyped to sell software, doesn't survive contact with the evidence here. Multiple independent witnesses, including a government watchdog, described the same trend. The scale is not the part in dispute. And notice the strategic shift the witnesses kept returning to. The old model checked your identity once, at sign-up, against government records and then trusted you. Burris argued that's obsolete because criminals now pass that one-time check with stolen or synthetic data, then operate freely. His phrase was that identity should be treated as critical infrastructure, monitored continuously, not verified once and forgotten. That's a real, defensible idea, and it's also exactly where the privacy worry begins. Now, how the scams actually work, because it's more organized than most people picture. Maimon describes something that surprises most people. Fraud is now taught openly. On the dark web and even the open web, he said, criminals run tutorials, sell toolkits, and coach each other on which targets are vulnerable, and they do it out in the open, no longer hiding. That matters because it means the barrier to entry has collapsed. You don't need to be a hacker anymore, you can buy the playbook. He also named where a lot of it comes from. Much of this activity, he testified, is driven by organized groups operating overseas, including networks known as the Yahoo Boys, and by actors tied to countries like Russia and China. One example that should worry every worker, fraud rings increasingly target retirement savings, going after people's 401k accounts, where a single successful theft can wipe out decades of savings. Here's the fair context on the foreign angle, because it cuts two ways. It's true that a large share of sophisticated fraud is transnational, which limits what any domestic law can do and argues for better verification at the door. But it also complicates the privacy debate, because you can't arrest your way out of a threat based overseas, so the pressure falls on building defensive systems here, at home, around your identity. The foreign nature of the threat is exactly why the domestic trade-off gets hard. And a steadying note against despair. None of this means the criminals are winning everywhere, or that ordinary precautions are useless. Freezing your credit, using strong authentication, and watching your account still stop the large majority of everyday fraud. The witnesses weren't describing a hopeless situation, they were describing an arms race, and arguing about which upgrades are worth their cost. That's a solvable framing, not a doom loop. Now the proposed fix, and its honest case, stronger digital identity verification. Give the fix its strongest case. When criminals can defeat a one-time check, the logical answer is verification that's harder to fake and that continues over the life of an account, watching for the signals that someone has been taken over. Done well, better identity tools genuinely do stop fraud before it starts, protecting exactly the benefits, tax refunds, and disaster relief that vulnerable people depend on. That's a real public good, not a corporate talking point. There's also a fairness point for the government's own tools. Platforms like the federal login system exist precisely so Americans can prove who they are without handing data to a dozen private companies. Supporters argue that a well-designed public option, with strong rules, is safer than the status quo, where your identity is already scattered across countless breached corporate databases. In other words, doing nothing is not a neutral, privacy-preserving choice either. And the witnesses were careful about one thing worth crediting. The serious experts did not ask for a single mandatory national ID card that tracks you everywhere. Burris framed it as infrastructure and standards, letting agencies verify risk more intelligently, not a universal government dossier. Keeping that distinction honest matters because the strongest privacy fears attach to the most extreme version, and that extreme version is not quite what the fraud experts proposed. Now the other side, and it is not paranoia, what a digital ID system could become. Jay Stanley of the ACLU laid out the core warning. A digital identity system, he argued, would be a disaster for individual liberty if it's not built right, because the same system that proves you can quietly become a tool to track everywhere you go and everything you do. His memorable phrase was that a badly designed digital ID could work like a virtual ankle monitor. That's a serious, specific concern from someone who studies this for a living. Congressman Maxwell Frost sharpened one edge of it. He pointed to the government contracting with data companies like Palantir to pull Americans' personal information into centralized databases, and warned that once that data is gathered, it can be abused or handed to private companies. His deeper point is about aggregation. Individual records are one thing, but combining them into a single searchable profile is a different and more dangerous thing. And Congressman Kwesi Mfume raised the most alarming example because it isn't hypothetical. He described a government efficiency effort using a Social Security identity database to mark thousands of living people as dead, causing real financial harm, and cited a whistleblower who alleged a plan to expand it. We should flag that some specifics of that claim are contested. But the underlying lesson stands. An identity system powerful enough to stop fraud is also powerful enough to hurt innocent people when it's misused. Even the chairman, Pete Sessions, engaged the civil liberties side seriously, which is worth noting. He pressed on where government investigation should stop, using an analogy about being penalized by guilt by association for the behavior of other people who simply shopped at the same stores. It was a striking moment. A Republican chairman and the ACLU circling the same worry. The data systems can punish you for connections you never chose. So here's the hard part. Nobody escaped. You can't fully separate the two. Here's the tension in one sentence. The more certain a system is about who you are, the more it necessarily knows about you. Strong fraud protection and strong privacy pull in opposite directions, and any honest expert admits you're balancing them, not perfecting both. The debate in that room wasn't good versus evil, it was where to set the dial and who gets to decide. One distinction does a lot of work here, voluntary versus mandatory. A digital ID people can choose, with alternatives, is a very different thing from one you must use to access basic services. Much of the privacy fear collapses if the system stays optional and minimal, and much of it is justified if it becomes required and expansive. When you hear this debate, that's the question to ask first. Can you say no? Another practical point both sides quietly share: centralized data is a target. The same database that verifies millions of identities is a jackpot for the very criminals we're trying to stop, so build it carelessly and you can create a bigger breach than the fraud you prevented. That's not an argument against all digital ID. It's an argument for strong design, data minimization, and independent oversight. On that, the fraud experts and the ACLU are closer than they sound. Before we weigh the sides, make it concrete, because this isn't abstract for the people hit. Picture the most common version. A retiree gets a call in what sounds exactly like their grandchild's voice, cloned from a few seconds of online video begging for emergency money. Or an investment app that looks legitimate, run by an overseas ring that slowly drains a life savings in what investigators call a long con romance and investment scam. These aren't rare edge cases, they're the everyday shape of the industrial fraud the witnesses described. And it clusters on the people least able to absorb it. Seniors, recent immigrants, and benefit recipients are targeted precisely because they're trusting, isolated, or dependent on government payments that a thief can redirect. That's the moral weight behind the fraud fighter's case, and it's why dismissing identity reform as mere corporate salesmanship misses something real about who actually gets hurt. Now look abroad, because other countries have already run this experiment. Estonia is the model the optimists cite. It built a national digital identity years ago, but paired it with real safeguards. Citizens can see exactly which official looked at their data, and misuse is logged and punished. It shows that security and privacy can coexist, but only because the rules and transparency came built in, not bolted on later. The tech didn't save them, the governance did. India is the cautionary tale. Its enormous biometric ID system expanded access to services for millions, a genuine benefit. But it also suffered data exposures in cases where people were wrongly denied benefits when the system failed to recognize them. Same core idea, very different outcome, because the protections were weaker. Together, the two examples make the honest point. The design and the guardrails, not the concept, decide whether a digital ID helps you or hurts you. Before we close, let's give each side its strongest, fairest case. Give the fraud fighters their due. They are not fear-mongering. The losses are real, the attackers have automated, and the people hurt worst are often the most vulnerable, seniors, disaster victims, and benefit recipients who can least afford to lose it. Asking the government to modernize how it verifies identity is a reasonable response to a genuine emergency, and refusing to act has a body count of its own, measured in stolen savings. Now give the privacy advocates their due. Every surveillance system in history was sold as a narrow tool for a good reason, and then expanded. The worry isn't that today's officials are villains, it's that infrastructure outlives the people who build it, and a database created to stop fraud can be repurposed by someone you'll never vote for. Insisting on limits, oversight, and an off-ramp before you build isn't obstruction. It's how you keep a good tool from becoming a bad one. And notice how much they actually agree on, because it's the real headline. Both sides want fraud stopped. Both accept the current system is failing. Both, pressed honestly, support strong rules, data minimization, and independent oversight. The live disagreement is about defaults and control, not about whether to act. That overlap is exactly where a workable law could be written, if the politics allow it. So let's total it up honestly across the whole hearing. Here's the fair scorecard. On the threat, it's real, large, automated, and getting worse, and that's not seriously in dispute. On the fix, better identity verification genuinely can help, especially for the vulnerable. On the danger, a poorly designed or mandatory system carries real surveillance risk that shouldn't be waved away. And on the path forward, the safe version is voluntary, minimal, well-governed, and independently watched. So where does it leave us? With a genuine dilemma, not a cartoon. The fraud is real enough that doing nothing is its own kind of harm. The cure is powerful enough that building it carelessly is its own kind of harm too. A serious country can protect people from criminals and protect them from its own tools at the same time. Refusing to choose between those two is the entire job. Watch three things from here. First, whether any digital ID plan is written as voluntary with real alternatives or quietly becomes required. Second, whether it includes hard limits on how the data can be used and who can see it. And third, whether there's independent oversight with teeth, not just a promise. Those details, not the slogans about safety or surveillance, are where your rights actually get decided. Because this isn't settled in a hearing room, and it isn't settled by a scary statistic or a Big Brother headline. It's settled in the fine print, in whether the word voluntary survives, in who holds the keys to the database, and in whether anyone is truly watching the watchers. That's where we'll keep watching. That is our breakdown. Stay with us.